Because those are designed to resemble the real world intentionally. So you have avatars representing people, you have money, you have trade, you have guilds and so on, things that are similar to the real world. And the interactions there may be interesting, but they're not interesting enough because they resemble interactions in the real world much too much. I'm going to talk about the communities that arise spontaneously on the internet. Those communities that are organic, that are defined by being on the internet and are not necessarily created, brought together. And these sort of communities are interesting, in part because the internet is like the real world. People interact on it, and obviously people exercise power on the internet. But the internet is also unlike the real world. So there are differences in the way that people act. For example, the potential number of people that you come into contact with on the internet can be much greater. And communication on the internet tends to transcend geographical boundaries, and it can be instant, and it can be anonymous, and it can be global. But perhaps the most important difference between the internet and the real world is that you don't spend all your life on the internet. Well, some of you do, I'm sure, but what I mean is that what happens on the internet often doesn't have the power to affect your real life, or what happens on one corner of the internet doesn't have the power to affect what happens on another corner of the internet, but to the same person. So a real-world citizen normally belongs to one political community, and everything they do, all their interactions, can sooner or later be related back to them via their country, via their government. But an internet citizen, or a netizen, I suppose, can have different facets of their personality belonging to different communities at the same time. And each of these communities can have different rules, and what happens in one doesn't affect the other. It's very easy to separate them. So what happens on the internet also stays on the internet. So if you leave, for example, comments on Justin Bieber's MySpace page, that probably won't affect the patch that you submit to the Linux kernel. Unless Linus is not a fan of Justin Bieber, I don't know. So the most important difference is that your offline and online presences can be separated, and your online presence can be, put into different boxes, segregated bits from each other. So what happens on the internet stays on the internet. Okay, so that's the introductory part, I suppose. So now that the actual analysis-y bit. So what I'm going to talk about is freedom, or liberty or freedom, and it's one of the most basic concepts in political philosophy. So remember, politics is about power, but what happens when there isn't any power? Well, you're free. Essentially, you're free, or you have liberty, as long as nobody has power over you. Nobody can tell you what to do. It's a controversial definition for some people, but we'll forget that for the time being. And I'm going to look at liberty in the context of a certain type of internet community. So the FLOSS community, or communities, I suppose. So I'm sure you all know that FLOSS stands for Free, Libre, Open Source Software. And within the FLOSS community or movement or whatever, different groups of people collaborate to produce software to meet their different needs, and there are all sorts of different ways of organizing projects. Some of them are academic, some of them are military, some of them are commercial, and some of them are hobbyists. So defining freedom within the context of political philosophy is, despite what I said, is actually a little bit difficult. And you'd think that freedom in FLOSS communities would be easy to define, because it's got free in the name, right? So, no. I mean, there's a reason that you have to refer to FLOSS communities as FLOSS communities, because you have to include free, and you have to include Libre, and you have to include open source so that you can cover everyone's way of defining themselves. So, but the reason that they use this long acronym, part of the reason, is that the word free in English has different meanings. So I'm sure you all know this: free as in speech versus free as in beer. Free as in beer being that something doesn't cost anything, and free as in speech being referring to freedom, liberty, that sort of free. So that can be confusing, but that's not really the point. I'm not talking about free as in beer, and it's pretty easy to avoid that meaning of the word. So it's only free as in speech that's relevant here. These are what we would call two different concepts of freedom. They're two entirely, well, almost entirely separate concepts. But separating these isn't really the problem. The problem is that even if you know you're just talking about free as in speech, there are still different conceptions of freedom. Each group working on a different software project is organized slightly differently, and because the main point of the community is to develop the software, the terms under which they contribute to the software and make it available sort of define them. In fact, for FLOSS projects, the license under which they release the code and contribute to the code is something like the constitution of their community. So the license is like the constitution. And different groups choose different licenses, so they have different constitutions, so they have different fundamental documents which say what freedoms they have. So because they have different constitutions, they have different understandings of what freedom actually is. So in the real world, there are many different types of constitution. I don't know where you all live, but I imagine you all live in democracies or republics or something like that. Even within relatively democratic states, there are different constitutions, but there are also totalitarian constitutions or communist constitutions, or I don't know if there are anarchist constitutions. There probably aren't, because I imagine anarchists don't go in for that sort of thing. So there are different, in the real world, there are lots of different types of constitution. But within the FLOSS community movement, there are only really two different types of constitution, or two large groups of constitution. So there are two main styles. That's interesting. Oh, there we go. BSD versus GPL styles. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this debate. People trying to decide what license they should actually use for their software. But in case you're not, here's a summary. So the BSD license. The BSD license is an example of the permissive family of software licenses. Under it, you can do more or less pretty much anything when you're redistributing the code, except you have to include the license and the copyright clause broadly. And things like, so it looks something like this, when there's more text than this, but essentially that's pretty much all you have to do. The GPL, on the other hand, is a restrictive software license. So there are a lot more restrictions, things you can't do with the code that you receive under the GPL. And to give you an idea, this isn't the license itself, it's a description of the license, but the GPL is supposed to guarantee these 4 freedoms which are set out in the license and enforced with various restrictions. So the main difference between the GPL style and the BSD style licenses is the presence or not of copyleft. Copyleft is a general method for making a program or other work free and requiring all modified and extended versions of the program to be free as well. So the BSD license doesn't include a copyleft clause, GPL does. So copyleft is actually quite similar to a concept from political philosophy. The American political philosopher John Rawls came up with this thing called the first principle of liberty. So what Rawls is trying to do is he's trying to say how states should be organized, and he's an American, so he says everything should be organized like America, except we'll do things slightly better. So he comes up with this idealized version of American liberalism. And what he says is that first, before anything else, when you're talking about justice in the state, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. So, in other words, you're free to do anything that doesn't make anyone else less free. Rawls piles on other conditions on top of this afterwards, which people don't like, but you can see there's at least somewhat of a parallel between these two. So, a copyleft provision, like that in the GPL, restricts the use of the software in a very specific way. What copyleft does is it prevents anything that's derived from the copylefted software from being made available in a way that's not free. Or the copyleft removes your right to your freedom to make things unfree. And because, as I said, members of FLOSS communities interact pretty much solely because of the software, or at least mainly because of the software, saying something about the software is equivalent to saying something about the whole community. So a FLOSS constitution considers people insofar as they contribute to the code, because it's a license for the code. So a restriction on what you do with the code is pretty much the only sort of restriction that that sort of community can impose on you. So if software is released under the BSD license without the copyleft clause, you can do pretty much what you like, and under the GPL, you can't. And so copyleft, a lot of people like it as a concept, and there are different reasons for using it. There are economic reasons, there are ethical reasons, there are technological reasons for using copyleft. But I'm interested in a political reason. So the question I'm going to ask about these FLOSS communities is, does releasing software under the GPL create less freedom than releasing software under the BSD? Or, in other words, is copyleft less free? So almost all of you will probably already know what you think about this matter. So it seems probably to some people like it's an obvious answer to the question, but I'm going to try to answer it anyway. So the first thing you have to do in order to answer the question about whether copyleft is less free is to define what you mean by freedom. Now, earlier on, I sort of glossed over that. I didn't say what I thought freedom was or what other people thought freedom was, because it's a difficult subject. But now that we've got a specific example in mind, let's have another attempt at it. So this is one way of thinking about freedom. And this was proposed by the political philosopher Hillel Steiner. I'm not sure if he was the first, but he definitely talked about it. And what he says is that freedom is proportional to the things that you can do. So suppose I'm standing alone on this stage. There are a number of things I can do. I can pace up and down. I can walk over this way. I can go and bang my head against the wall. There's a number of things I can do. But imagine I find this mouse. Now I've got the mouse. I can take it apart, take the battery out, I can throw it into the audience. There's a certain number of more things I can do. So when I have the mouse, there's more things I can do, so I'm more free. So it seems to stand to reason that if there are less things I can do, I become less free. And I think you might already see how this applies to copyleft. Let's think about the number of things I can do with BSD licensed software against the number of things I can do with GPL copylefted software. So here's the BSD license on the right, sorry, and here's the GPL. And here's the GPL. And here's the GPL. And here's the GPL, and it continues. So the obvious thing you can see, not without even reading the licenses, is that one is significantly longer than the other, and it contains more restrictions, and notably copyleft. So it seems like in the case where there are more restrictions under the GPL, you're less free. I mean, imagine if there was a license that prevented you from using the software for military use or using it for commercial use. It'd be pretty uncontroversial that that software is less free. So you might think that a similar line of reasoning applies to the GPL. If the software is copylefted, there are some things you can't do with it, so it's less free. Copyleft is still a restriction on what you can do, despite the aims of the policy. I mean, if you just think about it under a non-copyleft license, that you can do all the same things as under a copyleft license, except more. So more things you can do under the non-copyleft, without copyleft, so copyleft makes you, less free. There are more restrictions, less freedom. So that's one obvious answer.